We've all seen virtue signaling before. It's common enough that I don't think any of us would have a problem picking it out on sight. But for completionist's sake, virtue signaling is officially defined as an attempt to show other people that you're a good person. For example, by expressing opinions that will be acceptable to them, especially on social media. And the popular modern habit of indicating that one has virtue merely by expressing disgust or favor for certain political ideas or cultural happenings. James Bartholomew wrote in a now-deleted article on The Spectator back in 2015 that he coined the term virtue signaling, even though it was commonly attributed to other people, not him. The article was deleted, presumably because it's likely wrong. He popularized the term, but it was around in limited form before him. He probably grabbed it from something awful. There are other related terms that more or less refer to the same thing. Hashtag activism was coined in the mid-2010s to refer to people who cared a whole bunch about a social issue, but only if it had a hashtag that was going viral on Twitter. This was first popularized by Kony 2012, in reference to the Ugandan cult leader and terrorist Joseph Kony. Flag activism refers to people who change their avatars to incorporate some symbol after a tragedy, first popularized by the Facebook filter that would add a French flag to your avatar in the wake of the 2015 Charlie Hebdo Islamist attack in France. However, it stuck around in the form of pride avatars for Pride Month, or black square avatars in the wake of George Floyd. And long before any of that, we had the pejorative karma whore, describing a person who chases upvotes. Though this term eventually came to be used primarily for Reddit karma, it actually originated on Slashdot. Slashdot was a tech-based forum that was huge in the late 90s, though it's pretty dead today. But you could upvote people's posts and their account would gain karma, like on Reddit. The original karma whore was the Slashdot account Signal11, who was eventually discovered to be botting his karma score in a thread talking about the original Matrix release in 1999. Though karma whoring isn't explicitly political, it's still the same type of thing, manipulating your internet presence to appear good, while doing nothing that's actually good. There are other terms that get at the same thing. Champagne socialist, latte liberal, armchair revolutionary, baizuo in Chinese, but they're all kinda pointing in the same direction. The type of person who lives in a liberal, capitalist, democratic country who is very far left politically, or at least appears to be publicly, and expresses those opinions loudly in order to gain some type of social clout. In a previous video, I referred to the politics of these people as luxury beliefs, an idea that was brought into the modern conversation by Rob Henderson, but first developed by Thorstein Veblen. A luxury belief is an idea or opinion that confers status on members of the upper class at little cost, while inflicting costs on persons in the lower classes. A common luxury belief, once again in the wake of George Floyd, was the leftist slogan, defund the police. Anyone who lives in a crime-ridden area will tell you that defunding the police is a terrible idea, but it was American left-leaning thought leaders who advocated for the policy, not the people who were on the ground. In those locations where defunding the police actually happened, it was an absolute disaster. The upper class reaped the reward of appearing moral in public by advocating for the policy, while the lower class suffered from its negative effects. Virtue signaling is a very, very old practice, even if the terminology for it is new. Before any of these terms, we called it moral grandstanding. Before that, we called it showing your piety. In fact, if you want to stick with religious terminology, in the Bible, Matthew 6 verses 1-4 reads, "Beware of practicing your piety before the others, in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." This is obviously about people who make generous public donations and then reap a social benefit for it. The idea here is that truly virtuous behavior needs no reward, material or social. The behavior itself is the reward. From figures like Christ, Muhammad, or Buddha challenging the corrupt religious orders of their day, to kings or dictators going to great lengths to publicly display their morality, to individuals denouncing their friends or family in Soviet Russia or Maoist China, to people climbing all over themselves to prove they're not communists during the Red Scare in America. Each of these examples are of people who put more effort into actions that make them appear to be moral, instead of actions that are actually moral. Now, to be fair, sometimes there's also a push motivation instead of just a pull one. Those last two examples we can excuse, because the cost of not virtue signaling is pretty high in those circumstances. But the point is, for as long as there's been an understanding of morality, there's been a lingering question. How can a person appear to be moral and gain the rewards of being viewed as moral without actually putting in the effort to be moral? And guess what? That's another formulation of the free rider problem, which we spoke about last time. And you thought I was all done with making these tinier videos that lead into each other one after another. When I was in high school, the awareness bracelet briefly became the latest new thing. The American cyclist Lance Armstrong began to wear a simple yellow gel band to raise cancer awareness, which kickstarted the trend. Each color of band represented a different medical cause. Red was AIDS, heart disease, or drugs. Pink was breast cancer, or female genital mutilation. Green was Lyme disease. Blue was autism. Because these bands were a cheap and easy way to signal to others the social causes you cared about, they quickly moved beyond just medical topics. Pink became about feminism, green about the environment, and of course we got a rainbow one for the gays and a red, white, and blue one for the troops. I remember seeing at least one of these bands on the wrists of nearly every girl at school. Not so much the guys though. Buying a $1 bracelet to show your support for a cause is a lot easier than doing anything more substantive, like donating your time or a significant amount of money to that cause. But hey, a buck is a buck, it still adds up. When people wore one of those bracelets, it wasn't just saying that they supported the cause, it was saying that they gave $1 to that cause, assuming they bought the bracelet from an actual charity. There were also tons of fakes being sold where people just pocketed the cash. But what if you could signal your support for a cause without having to give up that precious dollar? Those bracelets largely fell out of style because with the rise of social media, people could do the same thing online for free, as hashtag activism, the avatar stuff, and all other forms of what was called in the 2010s clicktivism became popular. And just so we're clear here, this isn't strictly a political thing. People can virtue signal about moral systems that aren't directly tied to politics. Every time someone gets cancelled, whether justly like Dr. Disrespect or Chris Tyson, or unjustly like Chugga Conroy or Pro Jared, the people who do the dogpiling, they are virtue signaling. They're propping themselves up by pushing down a vulnerable target in public. They're showing that they have the proper morals, the proper thoughts, by marching in lockstep with those around them. However, even though virtue signaling isn't exclusively political, it is certainly political a majority of the time, at least nowadays. I think I've used more left-wing examples in this video so far, because there are some absolutely huge ones, the largest in recent memory being George Floyd and COVID. If you don't remember what it was like in 2020, let me refresh your memory. BLM was at the height of their influence after George Floyd's death, and they were going around the internet claiming scalps left and right. If you were a corporation or an influencer or any type of public figure, and you didn't explicitly come out in support of Black Lives Matter as fast as possible, you would have a fucking hate mob after you. Where BLM's virtue signaling was more push motivated, COVID's virtue signaling was more pull motivated. People were constantly taking selfies with like 3 masks on and goggles and a hazmat suit, sitting alone in their apartment, bragging about how they haven't seen another human being for months, while holding up a fully filled vaccination card to the camera so that they could post the picture to social media and get kudos from all their followers. While those are probably the largest single instances I can think of left-wing virtue signaling, it's not like the right doesn't also virtue signal too. Right-wing virtue signaling during the period of time between the 2020 election and the January 6th riot, or after the assassination attempt against Trump last month, was off the scale. And for various lower stakes events, both sides have absolutely no problem with pushing their public thought leaders to put out statements or cover topics, or demand that they disavow something. This happens everywhere. But here's the million-dollar question, and this especially pertains to those huge events that many people virtue signal over, whether that's George Floyd and COVID on the left, or the election or the assassination attempt on the right. What really is the problem with virtue signaling? I mean, the simple answer we've known since that Bible passage. We've known all the way through the statues of emperors, and the pogroms, and the Red Scare, and the gel bracelets and the hashtags. The problem with virtue signaling is that you're spending more effort on appearing to be good versus actually being good. Okay, fair enough, that's bad. However, that's also fundamentally an argument of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is bad, you shouldn't be a hypocrite, but is it the most bad thing? Not really. We're all hypocrites on something or another. We shouldn't be. We should tamp down on our hypocrisy as much as we can. But is it the final sin? No. Being a hypocrite is not anywhere close to being a rapist or a murderer. Virtue signaling on the internet is annoying, and it's certainly worth pointing out and laughing at. But what else is it? Another view of virtue signaling has cropped up in the past few years, admittedly mostly pushed by lefties in the wake of 2020, who have just gotten tired of being laughed at for virtue signaling. So this new argument is self-serving, but let's consider it on its merits anyway. Is there a positive side to virtue signaling? When I described Veblen's work on luxury beliefs in that previous video, I pointed out there was a biological component to it. Animals who have these elaborate mating rituals, where the male presents a display to the female that is generally otherwise useless, like a peacock's plumage, or a rifle bird's dance, or the gifts presented by crickets or nursery spiders. Veblen, as well as biologists who came after him, believe that these displays signal that the male has excess resources or fitness, such that he can waste some of them on the display, and so he's suitable to reproduce with. The peacock is probably the most extreme example of the bunch, signaling to the female that despite his bright colors, which make it easy for predators to spot him, he has nonetheless survived this long, so he's got to have something going on. Reproductive signaling is a larger part of signaling theory, where an animal provides honest signals to other animals about their intentions and abilities, in order to reduce expending resources on futile efforts. A great example is the antelope's tendency to jump around in place once it spots a predator. The antelope is honestly signaling its physical ability. It's saying to the lion, you can chase after me if you want, but I'm young and fast. You will expend a lot of energy trying to catch me. It's the same with brightly colored frogs that are poisonous. Rather than camouflage, the frog's biology is actively pointing itself out, with the attached warning of, if you eat me, you'll die. Of course, once this kind of system has evolved, dishonest signalers can benefit from it by signaling intentions or abilities they don't have. And the animal kingdom is full of examples of the interplay between honest and dishonest signal senders and receivers, all tangled up in a sort of evolutionary prisoner's dilemma. I think the main reason that virtue signaling caught on as a phrase, displacing the previous term moral grandstanding, is because it sounds like it comes out of sociology, like it's a real scientific term or something. It's not, it was invented on the internet like I showed earlier, but nonetheless it still clearly points at a human behavior that is real and can be studied and analyzed. And to be honest, it's probably related to signaling theory anyway. During the George Floyd riots, 2 professors of psychology who are also progressive activists published an article in Time claiming that despite the internet's tendency to laugh at virtue signalers, their fellow activists should still do it. They gave a bunch of reasons that I'll just summarize quickly. 1. A claim of virtue signaling implies that the person doing the signaling doesn't actually believe in the virtue. They're signaling only for clout. However, they might be signaling for clout about a virtue they actually believe in. 2. Even if a person is signaling virtue and gaining clout for it, that has nothing to do with whether or not they're factually correct, or what they're critiquing is factually incorrect. 3. A virtue signal can serve to change an observer's opinion about a topic, hopefully tilting it toward the speaker's position, not only by presenting a solid argument, but also by showing that there are social rewards for believing in that argument. 4. Critiquing virtue signaling is ultimately self-fulfilling, because a declaration that someone's a virtue signaler is itself a virtue signal. You are also saying that on the internet to make yourself look good. It's just that the virtue that you're signaling is that you don't like virtue signalers. It's ironic that the people who proudly state they are not virtue signalers are also the people who virtue signal probably the most straightforwardly with their statement. Probably most importantly of all is the idea that collective outrage on the internet has been normalized, for better or worse, and it's now being used as a bludgeon to get people to move on various positions. It doesn't matter if 10,000 virtue signaling Black Lives Matter Twitter accounts do nothing in real life, or even if they don't believe what they're saying. If they can convince a politician or a CEO to change their position, then they've done their job. I think this is why, even though the right wing has spent the last decade decrying virtue signaling, they've also grown accustomed to wielding it themselves throughout Joe Biden's presidency. I support the opposite of the current thing is just as much a virtue signal as I support the current thing. And seeing how NPC-style thinking, despite being fucking dumb, brought the left success, virtue signaling became understood as a powerful tool that the right could no longer ignore. The downsides of it, for everyone else, is that virtue signaling also has the effect of accelerating radicalization. As someone who's personally not a radical, I oppose it on these grounds. It's a weapon that should not be on the table. Nobody should be doing it. However, me saying so harkens back to point 4 on that list. My claim that I don't like virtue signaling is itself a virtue signal on some level, so it kind of feels like I can't even talk about the problem. On a few topics, I have followed the biblical example, the whole don't make a public statement about your alms thing, because doing the right thing is important, regardless of whether or not you're seen to do it. I don't like Nestle's practices, so I don't buy their products. After Blizzard's constant kowtowing to China, I stopped playing Blizzard games. However, did me telling you those 2 examples just now suck all the moral content out of my actions because I've made it public? Because now I'm no longer just privately giving my alms? This is where I think we hit the limit of that biblical, purely ascetic view of virtue signaling. If you truly believe that the right thing for people to do is in some moral code, then following it yourself quietly and never talking about it to anyone will do very little to actually convince others to also follow that code. Someone might notice what you're doing from the outside and ask you about it, sure, but let's be honest, that's pretty rare. We are a social species, and if you want other people to do those virtuous things, you will have to signal that virtue to them somehow at some point. The difference, I think, is in the cost of the signal. Think back to the male peacock again, with his costly display of feathers that nonetheless signals his fitness to females. A costly signal, specifically a signal that's costly because it's an honest display of what that signal represents, is not simply something that's put out into the world in order to garner status. It might still garner status, but that's not the point. The point is that it's a true representation of their virtue, which speaks to the true content of their character. A tweet that says, "I love the poor, #end homelessness," is a cheap signal, only posted to garner status. A tweet that says, "I love the poor, #end homelessness," with a picture of the poster volunteering at a soup kitchen is a more expensive signal, otherwise known as actions speak louder than words. But even then, people have faked more expensive signals too. We all know about politicians and their photo ops. Barack Obama in 2015 served Thanksgiving meals to veterans in Chicago, but it seemed like he was only there long enough to get a few good videos out of it. Paul Ryan, during his 2012 campaign, was seen washing dishes at a soup kitchen, but he actually did less than nothing. He took clean dishes and made them dirty again for the photos, and then he just left. And more recently, Trump delivered pizzas to a fire hall that had already been delivered. A staffer took the pizzas back to give to Trump after he got out of his limo. If the expense of a signal is simply money, you can bet that any politician has more than enough to convincingly fake that signal. There's probably no solution to this problem, at least as far as politicians are concerned. Either they get their photo op and they virtue signal, or they do more important things with their time and they get shit on. The Conservative leader in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, got blasted for not walking in this year's Pride Parade, and his response was simply that he's an elected member of Parliament and a leader of one of Canada's main parties, and that he has more important things to do. That's completely true for both Poilievre and Trudeau, but Trudeau went to the Pride Parade and got his public relations win, at the expense of an afternoon of the Prime Minister's time. Either way, they each gave something up. For people who aren't rich or well-connected, like you or I, people for whom true signals are still costly, then the social rewards for true signaling are more important for us to receive in order to recoup that cost. So there will always be people who repeat over and over on Twitter, trans rights are human rights, even where it's entirely uncalled for, because the conversation isn't even about that, and all they're doing is pissing everyone off. And there will also always be people who uncritically believe everything that Alex Jones or Tim Pool or their uncle's Facebook meme says, while also proclaiming that anybody who uncritically believes any mainstream news is a sheep. The former is just straightforward virtue signaling. The latter is virtue signaling while acting like only their opponents do it. The actual problem with virtue signaling is that it spreads dogmatic thinking rather than rational thinking. Even if some level of virtue signaling is necessary to create an in-group among like-minded thinkers, a space which can be gatekept, and a set of ideas which can be promoted, too much virtue signaling leads to the purity spiral. It causes people to silo off into their own cliques, who simply parrot back and forth to each other the latest hot take, without actually thinking it through. And then those people are so isolated from other arguments that they immediately crumple when challenged. How many times have you seen an irrational leftoid scream, Kyle Rittenhouse crossed state lines? Or an irrational rightoid scream, what about Hillary Clinton's emails? As a response to something completely unrelated, but it's a useful talking point they can pivot to in order to not actually address what their opponent's saying? That level of frothing at the mouth retardation can only exist among a population who are so used to telling each other that they're correct that they don't even know what to say when they get contradicted. So they fall back on virtue signaling. There's a reason that it's rational thinkers and not ideologues who prevail in the long term. The ideologue might be the foot soldier of a popular movement, at least for a time. He might play his part in turning a crowd, or forming a group, or even corrupting a whole political party. But on a long enough time frame, that way of thinking is a fire which will consume not only his enemies, but his friends as well. The purity spirals, the purges, the number of people who are cast out of the movement, or who are abused by it, and then begin to work against it, grows over time. Most people who say, I didn't leave the left left me, they are correct in that statement, and the right has begun its own similar descent. The reason for all of it is ideological thinking, rather than rational thinking, and the rise of virtue signaling is one huge symptom that it's happening. The moral fervors of our time are no longer over real good and evil, but over the failure to performatively condemn whichever evil is currently fashionable to condemn on any given day, or public performances which advocate for whichever good is currently fashionable. Either way, the image of moral action contains more value than the moral action itself. This can't go on forever. As long as appearing to do a moral action produces a greater value than actually doing a moral action, undone moral actions will stack up so high that the entire movement collapses. The left has learned this the hard way, though it sounds like they might need to beat their head against that wall a few more times before it sticks. Meanwhile, the right is currently barreling full on towards their own brick wall in this regard. There's no easy solution here. You need to be your own judge on this topic. You need to discern when and where it's appropriate to signal your virtue and when it's not. You need to be honest with yourself about your intentions, and you need to ensure that your actions match those intentions, at least sometimes. And most importantly of all, you need to not let virtue signaling dumb down your thinking. You need to recognize the difference between a slogan and an argument. There's dozens, probably hundreds of different interests and groups out there who want you to be as dumb as possible for their benefit. I'm not going to tell you what to think. I just want you to actually think.